Dad, please don't be upset with me. I just wanted to feel alive for once. The old cabin breathed with the night. Pine sap clung to the wooden beams, carrying a faint sweetness that mingled with the earthy scent of damp soil outside. Crickets hummed in the darkness like tiny clocks ticking against the silence, and the silver light of the moon filtered through the lake-facing windows, striping the floorboards in restless shadows. Jonathan Blake stood alone in the living room, sleeves rolled to his elbows, staring at the half-finished mug of coffee cooling on the table. He had brewed it out of habit more than need. Sleep had been an enemy for months now, ever since the doctors had added yet another word to the growing list of things that might happen to his daughter. He carried the mug without tasting it, pacing from one window to the next as if he could measure safety by the reflection of moonlight on the lake. Upstairs, a faint creak disturbed the hush. Jonathan froze, head tilting. It was late, too late for Lila to be awake. Her nightly routine was precise, a careful choreography of medications and gentle stretches before the slow ritual of sleep. Any break in that rhythm set off alarms inside him. He set the mug down and moved toward the staircase, each step sinking into the familiar groan of old wood. Another sound drifted down, a soft shuffle, like someone crossing the hallway. Not the clatter of a fall, thank God, but a whisper of movement. His chest tightened. Lila's legs could betray her without warning, even standing beside her chair was dangerous. Jonathan climbed faster, his hands skimming the railing. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender from the oil Sophie used to calm the air. Sophie. She was on duty tonight. The thought steadied him for an instant, but the unease remained. He reached the top landing and followed the faint glow spilling from Lila's bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar. He pushed it wider and the world inside him jolted to a stop. Near the open balcony, Lila clung to Sophie's arms. The girl's thin body trembled violently, her knees bowing under their own fragile weight. Sophie stood behind her, back straight, muscles taut, supporting every ounce of the child's weight. The balcony door was open to the night, and moonlight washed them both in a silver glow that made the scene look almost unreal. For a heartbeat Jonathan could only stare. His mind refused to match the image with reality. Lila, standing. Her feet touched the floor like a miracle in motion. Her head tipped toward the sky, curls falling loose around her face, eyes wide and luminous. Tears streaked her cheeks, but there was something else too. Something fierce. Hope. The word struck Jonathan like a blow. Then instinct roared back to life. What the hell is going on here? His voice crashed through the room, shattering the fragile quiet. Sophie flinched but did not release the child. Lila's eyes snapped toward him, wide with alarm. For a heartbeat no one moved. Only the whisper of lake wind pushed through the balcony door. Jonathan stepped forward, the old floorboards groaning beneath his boots. Sophie, he barked, what do you think you're doing? Put her down before she... Dad, stop. Lila's voice cut sharp and desperate. The sound of it startled him more than his own anger. His daughter rarely raised her voice above a whisper, illness had taught her to conserve every breath. Now each word trembled with defiance. I begged her, Lila said, her small hands tightening on Sophie's sleeves. I asked her to help me. Please don't be mad. Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs. Lila, you could fall. Your muscles. I don't care. Her cry sliced through him like a blade. I just wanted to stand under the stars. Just once. You never let me try. The air in the room thickened, dense as storm clouds. Jonathan felt every instinct of caution flare inside him, but something in his daughter's face, something raw and shining, held him frozen. For a long moment he could only hear the tremor of her breathing, the faint rustle of Sophie shifting her grip. Sophie's eyes met his. They were steady, though he could see the strain in the tightness of her jaw. She wanted to feel the night, she said quietly. Just for a moment. Jonathan's fists tightened at his sides. He opened his mouth to argue, but Lila's trembling voice came first. Everyone at school goes skating, she said, words tumbling out like stones she'd carried too long. They climb trees, they run across the field. And I just sit. They don't even see me. I'm like furniture. Dad, I don't want to disappear. Her knees wobbled dangerously. Sophie adjusted her hold, whispering encouragement into the girl's hair. Jonathan's throat constricted. Memories flooded him, the night of Lila's diagnosis, the sterile hospital corridors, the doctor's low voice explaining how one fall could undo months of fragile progress. He had promised himself that night, promised his late wife, too, that he would never allow a single misstep to steal their child. Every rule, every restriction, every sleepless night had been forged from that promise. But now, looking at her small body shaking with effort and fury, he saw what his love had become. A cage. The realization landed with the weight of a mountain. He had not protected her life, he had stolen it. Lila's eyes searched his, pleading. Just 1 minute, she whispered. Please. Jonathan felt his own breath falter. Around them the night hummed with quiet insistence, the crickets, the soft lap of water against the shore, the infinite patience of the stars. It was as if the world itself waited for his answer. He took a step closer. Jonathan moved closer, every step a battle between instinct and the aching pull of his daughter's eyes. The room smelled of pine and moonlit air. The balcony curtains swayed gently as if urging him forward. Lila's knees trembled, her weight sagging more heavily into Sophie's arms, but her gaze never wavered. She looked at him as though her very heartbeat depended on his next word. Please, she whispered. The sound was barely more than breath, but it reached him like thunder. Jonathan's fingers twitched. Every warning the doctors had ever spoken flared in his mind. Fragile muscle tissue, degenerative strain, irreversible damage if she falls. But beneath the noise of fear came another sound, quieter, sharper. His own wife's voice, from years ago, the night before she passed. Don't just keep her safe, John. Keep her alive. He crouched slowly, lowering himself until his eyes met Lila's. The moonlight sharpened every detail of her face. The thin sheen of sweat along her brow, the stubborn set of her jaw, the fragile hope that blazed through exhaustion. This was not recklessness. This was a plea for existence. How long have you been standing? He asked, his voice rough. 3 minutes, Sophie answered softly. Her arms tightened around Lila's narrow frame. She wanted 5. We compromised on 3. I'm holding most of her weight. Jonathan's gaze flicked to Sophie. There was no defiance in her eyes, only quiet resolve and the faint tremor of strain in her shoulders. She was risking her job, risking everything, for a child that wasn't hers. The realization cracked something inside him. Why? He asked, not sure if the question was for Sophie or his daughter. Lila's voice wavered. Because I'm tired of watching the sky from a chair. I want to know what it feels like to stand under it. Even if it hurts. Even if it's only for a second. Jonathan's breath caught. In that moment he remembered the countless nights he had carried her to bed. The way her tiny fingers had once clutched his collar as if anchoring him to life. He had spent years locking the world away, believing that control meant love. But love, he finally saw, was not control. Love was letting her reach for the stars even when gravity threatened to break her. The fear in his chest pulsed harder. He wanted to shout, to scoop her into the safety of her chair. To end this dangerous experiment. But another truth pressed harder still. If he ended this now, if he silenced her again, he might lose something far greater than her physical strength. He might lose the last fragile thread of trust between them. Jonathan exhaled a shaky breath. All right, he said at last, the word a reluctant surrender. 1 more minute. But I'm helping. Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. Lila's face broke into a trembling smile. He stepped behind them and placed his hands gently on Lila's thin shoulders. The heat of her effort burned through the fabric of her sweater. Her muscles quivered violently beneath his palms, each tremor a testament to the courage it took just to remain upright. Together they faced the balcony. The night stretched wide and endless, a velvet sky pinned with countless stars. The lake shimmered below, dark and alive, catching fragments of moonlight in its rippling surface. A lone owl called from the distant pines, the sound soft but commanding. Lila tilted her head back, eyes reflecting the sky. "It's bigger than I imagined," she whispered. Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was proud of her, that she was braver than anyone he'd ever known. But words felt small against the vastness of the moment. Sophie's voice broke the silence. "Breathe with me, Lila. Slow and steady." Lila inhaled, chest rising with effort. Her legs trembled like brittle reeds in the wind. Jonathan tightened his grip, silently promising that if she slipped, he would catch her before the earth could claim her. Seconds stretched into eternity. The stars above seemed to pulse in rhythm with the fragile strength beneath his hands. Then, with a tiny gasp, Lila shifted her weight forward. Her knees wobbled dangerously. Sophie stiffened. Jonathan's heart leapt. "Easy," he whispered. "I've got you." I can feel the floor," Lila said, voice trembling with wonder. "Not just with the chair. My feet. The wood. It's..." Her breath hitched. "It's alive." Tears burned Jonathan's eyes. He had carried her across the same floor hundreds of times, never realizing what it meant to simply feel it. To her, this was not ordinary wood. It was the proof of existence, the pulse of the world beneath her own 2 feet. A sharp tremor rippled through her legs. Sophie adjusted her hold. "Time," she said gently. "We need to sit before." "No," Lila gasped. "Just a few more seconds. Please." Jonathan met Sophie's gaze. Fear flickered there, but also respect. He gave a single nod. The 3 of them remained locked in that fragile tableau. The child defying gravity, the caretaker bracing against collapse, the father finally surrendering to life. Jonathan's mind drifted to the photographs tucked in the drawer downstairs. Pictures of his late wife twirling Lila in a summer meadow. Her laughter ringing like bells through a world that had not yet known hospitals or diagnoses. She had been fearless, always urging their daughter to chase butterflies, to climb low branches, to live. "Don't cage her, John. Promise me." His chest tightened. He had broken that promise in the name of love. Another tremor shook Lila's legs. Jonathan tightened his arms, feeling the raw, desperate strength within her frail body. Every quiver was a declaration, "I am alive. I am more than this chair." Finally, her knees buckled. Jonathan and Sophie moved in perfect sync, lowering her carefully back into the wheelchair. The instant she settled, Lila burst into tears, deep, shaking sobs that tore through the quiet night. Jonathan dropped to his knees before her, heart pounding. "I did it," she whispered between sobs. "I stood. I felt the stars." "You did," he said, voice breaking. "God, Lila, you did." Sophie knelt on the other side, brushing damp curls from the girl's face. "You are incredible," she said softly. "Absolutely incredible." Lila clutched Jonathan's hands, her fingers cold but determined. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise this won't be the last time." Jonathan's breath caught. He looked into her tear-streaked face and saw not weakness but unyielding strength. The same strength that had once lived in her mother's eyes. "I promise," he said, the words tasting like freedom. "From now on, we'll find ways. Real ways. Together." The promise settled between them like a quiet star of its own, burning steady and bright against the darkness. The cabin awoke to the smell of damp earth and the hush of lake mist drifting over the water. Jonathan Blake had not slept. He sat at the kitchen table long after the moon had vanished, a half-cold cup of coffee untouched before him, staring at the grain of the wooden surface as though it might hold an answer. Outside, the first streaks of dawn painted the sky with thin bands of rose and ash, but inside the cabin the air felt suspended, thick with the echo of last night. Every sound replayed itself in his mind. Lila's trembling plea. The faint scrape of her feet on the floor. The raw triumph in her whisper, "I felt the stars." Jonathan pressed his palms to his eyes, the memory cutting through him sharper than any knife. For years he had built a fortress of routines, doctor visits, physical therapy, medications lined in precise rows, believing that predictability could guard against disaster. Yet a single moment of rebellion had shattered the fortress like glass, leaving him exposed to a truth he had long refused to face. Behind him, the soft creak of a floorboard stirred the silence. He turned to find Sophie in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back into a loose braid, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She carried no tray, no morning checklist, only the quiet caution of someone stepping onto uncertain ground. "Morning," she said softly. Jonathan nodded without meeting her eyes. "Coffee's fresh," he murmured, though they both knew it wasn't. Sophie crossed the room and sat opposite him, folding her hands on the table. Neither spoke for a long while. The only sounds were the muted lap of water against the shore and the faint rustle of pine branches beyond the windows. Finally, Jonathan exhaled. "You disobeyed me." It was not accusation, not entirely, more a weary statement of fact. Sophie's gaze remained steady. "She begged me, Mr. Blake. And you weren't here. I trusted you to keep her safe." "I did." Her voice was calm, though a flicker of defiance sparked in her eyes. "She was never out of my arms. I would have caught her if she slipped." Jonathan clenched his jaw. The argument he had prepared, every warning, every medical statistic, collapsed before it reached his lips. Because beneath the surface of his anger lay something heavier, gratitude. Gratitude that Sophie had given Lila what he himself could not. "She could have been hurt," he said instead, his voice rough. "She's hurt every day," Sophie replied quietly. "She hides it because she thinks you can't handle it." Jonathan flinched. The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through the silence. He wanted to protest, to insist that he could handle anything for his daughter. But the truth was undeniable, he had spent years handling only what he could control. Sophie leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "She's lonely, Mr. Blake. She told me how the kids at school treat her like a ghost. She comes home every day pretending it doesn't bother her, because she doesn't want to see the panic in your eyes." Jonathan's throat tightened. He pictured Lila's quiet smiles at dinner, the way she always changed the subject when he asked about school. He had mistaken silence for acceptance, when it was really a shield. "She wants to live," Sophie said. "And last night was the first time I've ever seen her fight for it." Jonathan bowed his head. The room blurred at the edges, the weight of years pressing against his chest. He thought of his late wife, of the promise whispered in a hospital room smelling of antiseptic and fear. "Don't cage her, John. Promise me." "I thought I was keeping her alive," he murmured. Sophie's voice softened. "You were keeping her breathing. That's not the same." The distinction cut deep. He sat back, staring through the window where morning light spilled across the lake, turning the surface into sheets of molten silver. For the first time in years, the beauty of the world felt almost unbearable, because he realized how much of it he had denied his child. Footsteps echoed on the stairs, slow and uneven. Jonathan looked up to see Lila at the threshold, wheeling herself forward with practiced precision. Her hair was a messy halo around her face, but her eyes carried a spark he hadn't seen in months. "Morning, Dad," she said, voice small but bright. Jonathan rose instantly and moved to her side. "You should have called me," he said automatically, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "I'm fine," she replied. Her smile wavered, a fragile blend of triumph and exhaustion. My legs hurt, though. The good kind of hurt. Jonathan crouched beside her chair, searching her face. Last night, you were incredible. Lila blinked, surprised. You're not mad? He shook his head slowly. I was scared. Still am. But no, I'm not mad. Her shoulders sagged with relief. Then, can we do it again sometime? Maybe with the stars. Or the sunrise. Jonathan glanced toward the glowing horizon. The pink edge of dawn spread wider across the lake, reflecting in his daughter's eager eyes. For the first time, he saw not the limits of her body but the boundless hunger of her spirit. Yes, he said quietly. But we'll do it carefully. Together. Lila's smile blossomed, tentative at first, then radiant. It was the kind of smile that made the years of fear and sleepless nights feel almost worth it. Almost. Sophie rose from the table, her eyes softening as she looked at them. I'll warm up some oatmeal, she said, slipping toward the kitchen. Her retreat left father and daughter alone in the hush of morning light. Jonathan reached for Lila's hand, the small fingers curling trustingly into his own. I'm sorry, he said, the words tasting of salt and regret. For the rules. For the walls. For everything. Lila studied his face for a long moment. You were scared, she said simply. Jonathan nodded. I still am. That's okay, she whispered. So am I. The simplicity of her forgiveness nearly broke him. He pressed her hand between his palms, grounding himself in the fragile strength of her grip. Outside, the lake brightened into a sheet of silver fire. A pair of loons skimmed across the surface, their calls echoing through the crisp air, wild, uncontained. Jonathan followed their flight with his eyes and felt the first faint crack in the wall of fear that had defined his life for so long. It would not be easy. The doctors would warn him again. The world would remain dangerous. But danger was not death. And life, real life, waited beyond the safety of cages. Jonathan squeezed his daughter's hand and made a silent vow to the rising sun. From this morning forward, he would not simply keep her alive. He would help her live. The drive to the rehabilitation center stretched like a ribbon of cold gray asphalt through the woods. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the leather. Beside him, Lila gazed out the window with a quiet intensity, her wheelchair folded behind them, Sophie humming softly in the backseat. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long beams of gold that flickered through the pines. Each flicker felt like a heartbeat, steady, persistent, impossible to ignore. They had planned the trip in cautious whispers the night before, after Lila had drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. Jonathan had surprised himself by suggesting it first. Let's talk to Dr. Patel, he'd said, the words almost foreign in his mouth. Sophie's eyes had widened, but she said nothing. It was Lila who had sealed the decision with a sleepy, dimpled smile. Now, as the car bumped along the narrow road, Jonathan's mind swirled with doubt. The doctors had always warned against sudden strain. The thought of Lila collapsing under the weight of her own determination chilled him to the bone. But he could no longer hide behind fear. He had made a promise, and promises meant movement. Lila broke the silence first. Do you think Dr. Patel will be mad? She asked, her breath fogging the window. Jonathan glanced at her reflection in the glass. She might be surprised, he admitted. But she cares about you. She'll want to help. Lila nodded slowly, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the windowpane. I don't want her to take it away from me, she whispered. The stars. The standing. I don't want her to say it's dangerous. Jonathan's chest tightened. He reached across the console and rested his hand gently over hers. We're not here to take anything away, he said. We're here to find a way to keep it. Sophie leaned forward from the back seat, her voice warm and steady. And to make sure your body is ready for what comes next. Lila offered a small smile but didn't look away from the passing trees. The rehabilitation center smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linen, a strange blend of sterility and warmth. Dr. Aisha Patel met them in the reception area, her white coat crisp, her dark eyes sharp with curiosity. She had treated Lila since infancy, guiding them through years of therapy and setbacks. Jonathan braced himself for the lecture he expected. Instead, Dr. Patel crouched to Lila's level, her expression softening into something like wonder. "Sophie called ahead," she said gently. "So, you stood?" Lila's cheeks flushed. "For a few minutes. With help." "That's incredible," Dr. Patel said, her voice ringing with quiet awe. "Tell me everything." Jonathan blinked. No reprimand. No warning. Only interest. Lila described the night in halting detail, the moonlight, the trembling, the way the wood felt alive beneath her feet. Jonathan watched as Dr. Patel listened with genuine care, jotting notes on a tablet but never breaking eye contact. When Lila finished, Dr. Patel smiled. "This is promising. Your muscles are weak, yes, but the fact that you could bear weight at all is significant. With guided therapy, we might extend your standing time safely." Jonathan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Dr. Patel turned to him. "I assume you helped?" He nodded. "Good," she said simply. That's exactly what she needs, support, not limits. The simplicity of her approval struck Jonathan like a revelation. For years he had braced for bad news, for the inevitable no. Now, for the first time, a doctor was saying yes. They spent the next hour in the therapy room, a bright space filled with padded mats and parallel bars. Dr. Patel demonstrated gentle stretching routines, guiding Lila through exercises that activated dormant muscles. Jonathan stood behind his daughter, hands hovering protectively at her waist as she attempted each motion. "Weight on your heels," Dr. Patel instructed. "Slow breaths. Let your body remember." Lila's arms shook as she gripped the bars, her knees wobbling with each hesitant shift of weight. Jonathan felt every tremor echo through his own body, his muscles tightening in silent empathy. "You're doing beautifully," Sophie encouraged, her voice a steady anchor. A thin sheen of sweat formed along Lila's brow. Her face tightened in concentration, but her eyes, those luminous, unyielding eyes, shone with quiet triumph. For a heartbeat Jonathan glimpsed the impossible. A future where she might not only stand but walk, if only for a few steps. The thought filled him with equal parts hope and terror. After the session, Dr. Patel reviewed a cautious plan. Daily home exercises, weekly therapy visits, careful monitoring of fatigue. "We will aim for strength, not miracles," she said firmly. But strength is its own kind of miracle. As they left the center, Jonathan felt the world tilt subtly beneath his feet. For so long he had lived in a landscape defined by limits. Now, for the first time, he could see a horizon. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow opening of a flower. Every morning, Jonathan and Sophie guided Lila through gentle routines, stretching, light resistance, tiny shifts of balance. Each session ended with a brief attempt at standing, her body trembling but her spirit unyielding. Jonathan found himself transforming alongside her. The man who once measured life in warnings began measuring it in breaths, in seconds of upright triumph. He discovered the quiet joy of progress. The first time Lila stood for 10 minutes without Sophie's arms around her. The morning she balanced on her own for the length of a sunrise. The evening she asked, shyly but firmly, if they might try stepping forward. Through it all, fear remained, a shadow at the edge of every heartbeat. But it no longer ruled him. He carried it like a companion, an inevitable passenger on the road toward freedom. One crisp Saturday, as autumn bled gold into the trees, Jonathan wheeled Lila to the lakeside deck outside the cabin. The water shimmered under a wide blue sky, the air alive with the scent of pine and the faint cry of migrating geese. It was here, on this very deck, that he had first surrendered to her plea. Now it felt less like surrender and more like awakening. Ready? Sophie asked, her hands poised at Lila's shoulders. Lila nodded, determination shining in her eyes. Jonathan knelt beside her, heart hammering. Together they lifted her to her feet. The wood beneath them was cool and solid, the same floor that had once terrified him. This time, it felt like home. Lila inhaled deeply, her knees trembling but holding. Then, slowly, she shifted her weight forward. 1 foot. The tiniest of steps. Jonathan's breath caught as Sophie steadied her. The movement was barely an inch, but it carried the weight of galaxies. Lila looked up at the endless blue sky and smiled, a radiant, unstoppable smile. I stepped, she whispered. Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes. Yes, he said, his voice breaking. You did. The wind swept across the lake, carrying the sound of distant geese and the quiet promise of seasons to come. Jonathan wrapped an arm around his daughter's back, holding her steady as she stood against the vast, uncontainable world. And for the first time in 11 years, he believed, truly believed, that life would not simply go on. It would expand. Winter arrived early that year, laying a hush over the cabin and the lake. Snow sifted across the porch like powdered glass, clinging to the rails and softening every sound. Jonathan stood at the window long before sunrise, watching the moonlight fade to a pale wash of gray. Behind him, the house stirred with quiet breaths, Sophie asleep in the guest room, Lila curled under a thick quilt in the bedroom they now called hers. Only the faint creak of the old cedar beams broke the silence. It had been 3 months since the first step. 3 months of steady therapy, cautious hope, and late-night whispers of plans they barely dared to name. Jonathan traced a finger across the frosted glass, sketching a rough circle that quickly vanished in the cold. Every inch of progress had felt like a miracle, but tonight, as he waited for the day to begin, fear slid back into his chest like an unwelcome guest. Dr. Patel had called the evening before with news. The hospital in the city had approved Lila for a cutting-edge muscle stimulation program. It could accelerate her strength, maybe even lead to independent steps. But it also carried risks, strains, setbacks, the possibility of heartbreak if results came slower than promised. Jonathan had thanked the doctor, hung up, and stared at the phone until the room turned dark. The old questions returned like ghosts. Was he pushing her too hard? Was he chasing hope to soothe his own guilt? He pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered the prayer he never quite believed in. Let me be brave enough to let her live, even if it breaks me. A soft sound interrupted his thoughts, footsteps, light but determined. He turned to find Lila in the doorway, wrapped in a wool blanket, her hair a tousled halo of dark curls. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Could say the same for you, Jonathan replied, forcing a smile. She padded closer, the wheels of her chair gliding silently. When she reached him, she tipped her head to see the first faint streaks of dawn. It's beautiful, she whispered. Like the sky's holding its breath. Jonathan crouched beside her. Dr. Patel called, he said gently. She thinks you're ready for the new program. Lila's eyes widened, reflecting the dim light. That's good, right? It could be, he admitted. But it's intense. Harder than anything you've done. I need to know if you want it. Not me. Not Sophie. You. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached out, her small hand resting against his cheek. When I stood for the first time, you were scared, she said softly. But you still held me. I want to try this too. I don't care how hard it is. I'm tired of being afraid of my own body. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. The courage in her voice outshone any sunrise. Then we try, he said, his voice rough. But we try together. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital corridors, humming machines, and the sharp scent of disinfectant. The therapy sessions were grueling, electrodes sparking gentle pulses through muscles that had long forgotten how to work. Some days Lila left the clinic trembling, her face pale with exhaustion. Other days she grinned through the sweat, daring the world to doubt her. Jonathan was there for every moment. He learned the rhythm of her treatments, the subtle signals of fatigue, the quiet language of encouragement that required no words. He also learned to step back when Sophie guided the sessions, to let Lila fight her own battles. One bitter January evening, after a particularly difficult session, Lila slumped in her chair, eyes glazed with fatigue. Snow whirled outside the hospital's glass doors, blurring the world into white. Jonathan knelt beside her, heart aching. "You don't have to prove anything," he murmured. "We can stop whenever you want." Lila turned her head slowly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Dad," she whispered, "this is me proving something to myself." He swallowed hard and nodded, the sting of tears warming his eyes. By late February, the transformation was undeniable. Lila could stand for 20 minutes without support. She had taken 3 careful steps with parallel bars and Sophie at her side. Every milestone filled Jonathan with a swelling mix of joy and terror. He had learned that love was not the absence of fear but the decision to keep walking through it. One evening, after a long day of therapy, they returned to the cabin for a weekend of rest. The sky was alive with stars, the lake frozen into a sheet of silver. Inside, Sophie built a fire while Jonathan wheeled Lila to the familiar porch where their journey had begun. The night was biting cold, but Lila's eyes glittered with quiet determination. "Dad," she said, "I want to try here." Jonathan hesitated. "There's ice on the boards." "It's..." "Please." The single word carried the same plea he had heard the first night. "See me. Let me try." He nodded. Together, he and Sophie positioned her between them. The wooden boards creaked underfoot, echoing memories of that first trembling attempt. "On 3, Jonathan whispered. 1, Sophie said, her voice steady. 2, Lila breathed. 3. They lifted, and Lila rose, her legs quivering but strong. The cold bit through their coats, but the air around her felt charged with something electric. For a heartbeat she stood without their hands, balancing on her own against the icy night. Then, with a soft gasp, she took a single step forward. The sound was barely more than a whisper of rubber on wood, but to Jonathan it roared louder than a thunderclap. Another step followed, slower, surer. Sophie's breath caught. "You're walking," she whispered. Lila's face lit with a radiant smile. "Just a little," she said, her voice trembling with awe. "But it's mine." Jonathan felt the world tilt, not with fear but with a dizzying, unstoppable joy. He reached out, not to hold her up, but to steady himself. In that moment he saw the truth with crystal clarity. Every wall he had built out of love had only kept them apart. Every rule meant to protect had merely delayed this miracle. He knelt as she took another careful step, the snow-silvered stars blazing overhead. His voice cracked as he whispered the words he had carried for months. "I see you, Lila. Not the chair. Not the fear. Just you." Lila turned her face toward the sky, tears glinting like tiny stars. "Then walk with me," she said. And he did. The 3 of them remained on the porch long after the cold numbed their fingers. Lila stood between her father and Sophie, their breaths mingling in the icy air. The night held them like a fragile promise, a family rebuilt not through protection, but through trust. Jonathan felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders. The future was still uncertain. There would be setbacks, pain, days when the chair reclaimed its place. But none of that mattered now. Because courage had taken its first steps. Because love had finally learned to let go. And as the first pale streaks of dawn broke across the frozen lake, Jonathan tightened his arm around his daughter's shoulders and whispered the vow he would keep for the rest of his life. "From this day on, you will never face the world in silence. You will live every breath, every stumble, every triumph, free." Lila leaned against him, her smile brighter than the rising sun. "I already am," she said. "Please don't forget to tell us where you're watching from." Please subscribe, like and share. Timeless Stories love you.
Subscribe to Timeless Stories now, and let's discover new worlds, meet new characters, and explore the infinite possibilities of the human imagination. Subscribe now and get ready to be transported to new worlds. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from.